So let's kind of pivot a little bit now, and I kind of wandered through a lot of background, but really getting to this point of having the ability to negotiate for and ultimately acquire this hydroelectric asset in the middle of our reservation, we really need to look back and appreciate the positioning that our tribal people have done over time to always be thinking beyond where we're currently at, which is interesting. I was going to my career with the Forest Service. I worked for an engineer, a fairly young guy out of Idaho, and his dad was a surveyor, and he ended up as an engineer for the Forest Service. Really nice guy. I liked him, and so he's kind of my mentor for a while, as well as my supervisor when I first started with the Forest Service. And he said, "Brian, my dad gave me probably the best career advice." He said, "So I'll pass it on to you." And he said, as a surveyor, you always got to be, if you're going to be efficient at surveying, you got to be thinking, okay, where do I need to be next? Where do I need to be? What's the next point I need to get to? So his dad running the instruments could grab the data. He said, so that's really been some very good career advice for me, is to always be looking at where do you need to be next. And so I really look at that and say, our tribes were really good at looking at the situation and saying, where do we need to position ourselves to be next? And that next might be tomorrow, it might be 100 years from now. But that was the thought process as I look back at it, to position us for where we're at today, which I'll start with the treaty. And I've learned a lot about the treaty in spite of the fact that in 1992 I had no exposure to it. But treaty in and of itself is really quite an interesting, when you dig into it and understand the context of it, and the paradigm of the federal government at the time when they negotiated that treaty with us. Now, for the most part, except for the Bitterroot aspect to it, but the main Flathead Indian Reservation part of it, we were fortunate in that we negotiated that treaty. And it wasn't at the end of a gun barrel. We negotiated that treaty with the United States at a time when the United States was trying to promote settlement of the Northwest because Canada was beating us. And you don't have to look very hard at our landscape as far as owning this part of the country, because David Thompson was here. He established commerce with the Salish and Kootenai people through Canada and was here. In fact, the Morgeau name comes from fur traders. The Matt name, my grandpa's Matt from Grovon, which is brother of the Matt that came here to Flathead, all came through the Canadian fur trade. So the U.S. was losing. And at the time, I was educated on this by an attorney that was the attorney for the Columbia Basin Fish and Wildlife Authority. Nice man. Joe Mentor's his name. Really had tribe's best interests at heart, and understood the history of Stevens treaties in the United States as the strongest treaties in the United States, because we negotiated them not because of a result of war. It was to promote commerce and settlement, peaceful settlement. And he said the United States was not in a strong negotiating position because this was pre-Civil War, Brian. They didn't have an army. So there wasn't an ability for them to come out and force this issue. And so the governor of the territory of Washington at the time, Governor Stevens, marched right up the Columbia, first up and down the coast and then up the Columbia, establishing treaties with tribes to really give up ownership of the landscape and allow for peaceful settlement. Because the other part of that, and it comes from colonial, is that the native peoples, if they're here, there's some ownership you got to recognize. So that was prevalent in the courts. Dan would be much better to talk to that than me, but that was happening. And so David Thompson marches up the Columbia. And as a tribal people, of course, we were exposed to what was happening in the East. We'd been there 3 or 4 times to get the black robes from St. Louis. So the tribes saw what was happening, and we had this big push in the east of the Plains tribes up against the mountains into areas where we buffalo hunted. Thus the competition for that resource and the fighting and the strife that came along with it. So we saw it happening, and so as a tribal people at that point in time said, you know what? This is an opportunity for us. Let's take this opportunity, agency as you say, deploy our agency and say, where do we need to be next? And so negotiated then our treaty, and it was 2 pieces. Sadly, we only get this piece, but negotiated for the Flathead Indian Reservation, 1.2 million acres in the heart of our Aboriginal territory, which at the time extended from eastern Washington all the way out to central Montana and even farther, eastern Montana. And so as a tribe, to wrap our heads around, okay, you got to give up all of that, but you get to preserve this little piece, and you get access to resources outside of this, all negotiated by our tribal leaders at the time. And I look at that and go, man, that's pretty dang good. So that's where the positioning really started. Now, we go then through the first 50 years of that treaty, and it was really working okay for us as a tribal people, fairly well situated economically. We were surviving. We did have some off-reservation disputes that didn't go well for us. Lost the Bitterroot. The hunting rights were challenged immensely with the game warden killing the tribal hunting party in the Swan Valley. But other than those things, it was going fairly well for us. But the United States, on the other hand, continued to promote the assimilation of tribal people across the country into mainstream America. So this then created the allotment era, whereby forcing tribal people, whether they wanted to or not, to embrace the idea of land as a commodity, which that was not us. We didn't view land or Mother Earth as something to own as a commodity, but the rest of the United States and the rest of a big part of the rest of the world did and do still today. So that was imposed upon us in the early 1900s, in spite of our quite a few efforts to avoid it. We were successful at first, probably for the first 15 or so years of that policy being implemented in the U.S. We avoided it, but ultimately got it imposed upon us in the early 1900s, which creates then this tremendous disruption of life here on the reservation. First, the land gets chopped up and divided up into agriculturally economic units at the time, because they were said we were going to turn the Indians into farmers. There were some already here that were doing quite well. They didn't need any help, but the idea was just like farmers across the rest of the country, you all need a piece of land to start with, and so we'll start with that. And then there was always this thought on the back side of it that there's way more land on that Flathead Indian Reservation than what those tribal people need, so let's get it all allotted, and then there's going to be a whole bunch left over. We're going to open that up for homesteading for non-tribal members. And so that was really what took place over a period of 10 to 15 years. The irrigation project was part of all of that because of twofold. Number one, we have the opportunity to put one here. Pretty unique. It's just how we're situated as a mountains catching the snow and the water flowing back across the valley. Great opportunity for irrigation. So, but with that, the justification becomes you can make a lot smaller agriculturally economic unit. So instead of 360, maybe you only need 80 or 40. And so if they only need 80 or 40, well, that means there can be a whole bunch more out here available as well. And so that was the strategy. And along with that then came the development of power electricity here on the reservation. First for the communities. Then there was a part of the irrigation project that needed pumping to support Pablo Reservoir. And the pumps in the Flathead River needed to have electricity in order for them to assure that that portion of the project would always have water. Because other than the pumping, it does not. So the Moise Valley and the upper Mission Valley here, where the soil is most lucrative because of the large sand, silt, or loam deposits from the Glacier Lake Missoula days and all the winds when there was no vegetation here, creates this good soil. So they wanted to make sure that Pablo Reservoir always had water in it. So put the pumps. Well, you got to power the pumps. Well, we're going to put power development in the lower Flathead River where it's currently located. So all that was happening, but the federal government couldn't handle the power part of the infrastructure build. They could do the rest of the irrigation project, they did okay, but when it came to drilling a hole through the rock down there, they couldn't get it. They invested about $100,000 and it failed. So Montana Power Company comes on the scene, and the way I always put it in shorthand, Montana Power Company came on the scene and said, federal government, you ain't thinking big enough, let us do this and we'll take care of it. And so they did. And a couple things about all of that, and then I'll talk a little bit about the tribe's agency in all of this. You really need to wrap your head around who Montana Power Company was. I mean, for generation of today, you look at Montana Power Company and you think, it was something in the past. Well, Montana Power Company was arguably, in the 1930s, probably the most powerful electric company in the United States. Closely aligned business-wise with the Anaconda Copper Company, which was the richest, part of the richest city in the world, Butte, Montana. Incredibly politically influential, nationally, certainly within the state of Montana, but also nationally, and also they had a worldwide presence. The folks in Butte had a worldwide presence because of the commodities, the copper that was coming out of the ground there. So Montana Power Company's coming onto the scene here was part of this whole paradigm that the reservation was going to go away, that we no longer were going to exist. In fact, here's a story for you. 1992. I come from the Forest Service and Fish and Wildlife Manager, and at the time the Bureau of Indian Affairs was still operating our tribal forestry program. And so, but they used the same methods for developing timber sales. You had environmental assessments, you had follow NEPA and all that good stuff. So I was very good at all that. I'd been doing it for 10 years. So literally, I'd get a forest timber sale from the Bureau of Indian Affairs parked on my desk and, Brian, we got a comment on this Fish and Wildlife wise. I said, all right. So I tore into that environmental assessment. I opened it up, and the first cover is a map of the Flathead Indian Reservation. And I still had good eyes then, so I could read small letters. And in the small lettering on the edge of that border of that Flathead Indian Reservation, it says, Former Flathead Indian Reservation. I just went, what is this? So I went and asked Rhonda, I said, well, what's this all about? And so got a little bit of history of the federal government really promoted this idea that the Flathead Indian Reservation was going to go away. And I've seen, so then I started paying attention, and I saw an old Forest Service map, Julie, from the 1950s that still said former Flathead Indian Reservation on a U.S. Forest Service map for western Montana. And so it was really a prevalent perception of Montanans, western Montanans especially, that the reservation was going to go away, so by golly, get up there and get your piece of it. So Montana Power Company comes on the scene and says, yeah, we'll develop this. And it aligned with their business model for developing hydropower across Montana. At the time, they had already developed Thompson Falls, some of the Missouri River facilities. And this particular spot it is a tremendous hydropower spot. In addition to it being a tremendous resource culturally and naturally to us as tribal people, it's also a tremendous power spot, which is ironic. I think I heard Vernon Finley say, yeah, it's always been powerful for us as tribal people. It was then and it is today. So they come on the scene, and they're actually part of then the establishment of the original Federal Power Act at the same time in the 1920s, because they're negotiating at the national level for the license from the newly established, at that time they called themselves the Federal Power Commission, to develop this site in the middle of a reservation here in Montana. And from a tribal perspective, when you look at everything that was going on, it was happening and coming at us like a freight train, and we weren't stopping it. And so the tribal leaders really, again, exercised agency and said, okay, this is going to happen. Where do we need to be next? And what can we do in order for it to continue to allow us to be here on the landscape over time? And so as a result of that first license getting issued, we get opportunity to get paid a little bit of money. Which there, to be fair, there was no economic structure for power like we have today. It was all new. You know, people even at that point in time said, well, what do I need electricity for? I do fine without it. And did. And that was not just reservation tribal people. That was that was an attitude across the West, because all of the hydropower system for the Columbia was getting built at the same time, and people, same thing, were looking at the federal government and FDR and saying, what do we need dams for? We don't need electricity. We do fine without it. So there wasn't a good economic structure for it, and big reliance on it. It was kind of a promotion. And so we had a friend in Senator Wheeler at the time, and he really promoted an assured opportunity then for the tribes to get a payment for the building of this facility on our properties. And I look at that and go, at the time he was probably an anomaly in the legal world, understanding the tribe's constitutional obligation through our treaty and assuring that we were getting a fair shake because of the negotiations from 1855. So ultimately resulted then in the first license getting issued to the Montana Power Company, and they were required to hire tribal members and also required then to pay us the land rental payment, which eventually escalated up to about $2 million at the end of that first 50 years. So that was all kind of put in place through the tribes sort of looking forward. And keep in mind at the time, we're in the middle of the Depression, and that Depression struck here as well at a time when allotment and assimilation policies were imposed, and they failed across Indian country. And I think Ron really taps on that pretty good in his chapter of his book. And I can't remember the name of the study that was done. It was an officially Department of Interior study on the effectiveness of allotment and assimilation of tribal people, and every place it just failed. And so the federal government says, we're going to take a different path. And so passed the Indian Reorganization Act in 1934-35. And so as a tribal people, we've got this stuff right in front of us. And again, our tribal leaders said, well, where do we need to be? We need to grab our constitution and become our own government, and immediately started buying back the reservation, because we had lost first allotment. And when I was in lands, I got to study this pretty closely and look at, okay, what happened history-wise here? and could see that originally the government was sincere in their giving the tribes the best lands, most of the lands that were served by the irrigation project, but they were also the most lucrative agricultural lands. And you look across here now, and most of those aren't owned by tribal members because of taxation and other liens being placed on those, and tribal members not embracing the idea of land as an asset, and not being able to roam freely across the reservation and take care of ourselves. So the economic structure for us as a tribe was really upset, and then you had depression on top of it, and so we needed work, and so negotiated as well that the company was required then to hire tribal members to build the dam, and so many of them were hired, but sadly we were also classified as unskilled labor, so given the most dangerous jobs, and thus ending with 11 tribal members being lost during that construction. So more sacrifice of the site, of people, of the entire reservation as we went through this period. But in spite of all of that sacrifice here, the tribal leaders again said, you know what, at the time we were down to less than 30% of the reservation owned by the tribes or tribal members. Kerr Dam being built, and it was something none of us could imagine at the time. The irrigation system being built as part of that, tremendous disruption to our resources. I think every stream on the front of the missions is intercepted by the irrigation project. And so seeing all this happen, and the tribal leaders said, in order for us to position ourselves, again, using agency to say where to next, to perpetuate our culture, we need to make sure the reservation remains intact. And so said, okay, well, we've got all this happening. We need to take this new path that's being offered to us. And so we did, and adopted our constitution, and became the first tribe in the country then to become organized into the Indian Reorganization Act. Formed our government. Maybe it's not perfect. Maybe there's some tweaks to that constitution. But the fact is we formed a pretty stable government that has allowed us to continue to make and implement long-term decisions. And some of the first ones that were made by the original tribe was to use revenue from, really at the time, timber harvest to buy back the reservation, and immediately started to buy it back. So that today now, with the recently brought back into tribal ownership bison range, I think we're really close to 70% of the reservation being owned. So again, another example of us just this always looking to where do we need to be next.